Russian advances are continuously slowing down in Ukraine as the Ukrainians are ever better able to hold the line. But we'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. The Russians have flown the biggest attack on Ukraine since a full month. The Russians used 9 Kh-101 cruise missiles launched from Tupolev 95 MS. They also launched 10 caliber cruise missiles from the Black Sea, from ships that were in the eastern Black Sea after talks of a ceasefire there. They used 6 Iskander ballistic missiles as well as 109 Shahid drones in attacks. The Ukrainians are reporting 93 of them were shot down or got lost, usually meaning electronic warfare, which means 16 of them got through, a full 14.7%, showing again that the Russians are currently improving their effectiveness of the Shahid drones. Last week, more than 1,640 gliding bombs as well as 670 attack drones were used by the Russians, together with more than 30 cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. We'll start off with the developments along the front line, and here the Russians have advanced in the town of Bazivka. We have a geolocation of the Russians now having reached the southeastern part of the town. The northern part is likely under Russian control now, and the Russians are now having been confirmed in the southern part of the western south. In the south of the western part, and now at almost the southernmost part of the eastern part as well. Inside of Kursk itself, the Russians are also advancing in the town of Guevo, which is here. The Russians have been seen here in the center of Guevo. Then they were in the western part. And now we have them in the southern part as well, indicating that probably the majority of Guevo is at the very least a contested area. Roughly this area here can be considered as contested. Part of it should be under Russian control as of now. Russian mill bloggers are also talking about the fighting here in the Bryansk Oblast. Here the Russians, Belgorod. Here the Russians are saying fighting is continuing in the area of Demidovka and Popovka. So the Russians still have not been able to push the Ukrainians completely out of Belgorod again. That was it from the Kursk region. We switched to Kharkiv, and in Kharkiv, while there is no developments on the ground, no change in control, we do actually have developments. The Ukrainians are saying that the biggest infantry attack for months has happened since a long time. The exact composition of it is unclear, but they said that they were able to see the Russians gathering before the attack itself happened, and this allowed them to defeat the attack. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians suffered 120 men in casualties in 5 to 6 days. In the area, according to the Ukrainians, it's mostly the usage of penal recruits on the Russian side. We go to the developments on the eastern front, and here we have the Russians extending their foothold in the town of Kamyanka. I have a geolocation of this at this point here. In the last situation report, we had the Russians in this area here, so they seem to be advancing slowly forward inside of Kamyanka. The Russians also took area close to Zapatne, including parts of Zapatne. Roughly this area here has fallen to the Russians over the last few days, meaning that the majority of Zapatne is now fully under Russian control. Further south, the Russians have advanced at Makivka. Actually, my mistake, it was the Ukrainians who have advanced here at Makivka. Makivka is here, and the Ukrainians have advanced not much. This is shelling of a Ukrainian position at this point here, which means that the Ukrainians have reached this area here, have managed to gain a foothold in the contested area closer to Makivka. Overall, an advance of probably less than 200 meters in this area. That's it on the developments along the front line. We in territorial changes. The Ukrainians are reporting about new concentrations of Russian troops in the central area here, roughly in this area, which would obviously mean that we should expect additional Russian attacks in the near future. Also in the area of Liman, the Russians are reporting that the Ukrainians are reporting that the Russian soldiers increasingly attack with AT mines that they carry with them, so anti-tank mines, to throw them into Ukrainian positions and blow them up, which in the majority of cases is not working according to the Ukrainians. South of the Siversky Donetsk, we have the Russians advancing at Verkhnokamianske. Here we have a geolocation of the Russians at this point, and as you can see, those are the three lakes that is easy to see here, and the three lakes are here, meaning the Russians have roughly reached this point. This again does not necessarily mean consolidated control, but we have the Russians advancing and being spotted in areas further to the west, from roughly up here to down here to this area and now to down here. All of this should probably mean that the area here is no longer held by the Ukrainians, but at the very least contested area, according to the geolocations of the past weeks. Further to the south, the Russians have advanced and tried to attack at the canal close to Klishivka. In Chasiv Yar itself, I do not see any change, but we have the Russians here at the canal in west of Klishivka, and then we have them crossing over at Uzaryanivka. So Russians at this area, and here they've managed to get over to the other side of the river and were attacking there, so likely an extension of the contested area in this area, in this region. Further south, I actually do not see any change in Toretsk itself over the past few days. We go to the area of Pokrovsk, and here we have the Russians in fighting Ukrainians in the north of Shevchenko, thus indicating us that the Ukrainians must still have permanent positions in here, or at least at the time of the video they still had some. This was at this point here, so the Ukrainians were still having positions inside of Shevchenko at the time of the geolocation. Further to the west, the Russians have continued attacks in the east of Udachne. We have a geolocation of this as well. In the easternmost houses, Russian soldiers were attacked, indicating that the Russians have recently operated here in the east of the town. Further south, the Russians have advanced north of Andrivka. We have a geolocation of this here. The Russians, this is here at this here, meaning the Russians are pushing further to the west in this region as well. That was it from this overall region here. We have one more geolocation, and that is from the Zaporizhzhia front. Here the Russians are in Stepove, in the northern part. We had the Russians recently down here. We had them all along this road. Now we have them here as well. And I see Ukrainian mill bloggers confirming that Stepove has fallen to the Russians. So likely the new front line is probably somewhere like this here. This should be under Russian control as of now, which are the Russians are getting closer to the first fortified defensive line of the Ukrainians in this region. That was it with territorial changes. And while the Russians are advancing, even though we do have some Ukrainian counterattacks as well, the Russian successes are still limited. The British Ministry of Defense assessed that in March the Russians have advanced 143 square kilometers. They gained 143 square kilometers. In February it was 195. In January it was 326. In December it was 393. And in November it was 730, showing that the speed of the Russian advances is steadily decreasing. The Russians are getting slower and slower, thus clearly showing that the discrepancy in forces along the front line right now is shifting or in favor of the Ukrainians, at least as of now. We'll obviously have to see to which degree that might change in the future. In troop generations, we have news from the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence. They said that that they for the first time found Indian parts inside of Russian drones, indicating that Indian companies participate in the Russian production of attack drones here as well. In the political sphere, we have some changes. The delegations of the British and French general staffs have reached Kiev and spoken with Zelensky and Syrskyi. The discussions are about potential stationing, potential operations, and the jobs of what the British and French forces are supposed to do in the future. And while that sounds like the French and the British might engage in the war in Ukraine, the talk is actually just for securing the peace after a signing of a peace treaty, so as peacekeepers. This does not mean French or British forces are being sent to Ukraine now to in some way play a role in the current war. And then again, the Russians using caliber from ships in the Black Sea is once again showing that Russia is clearly not having a ceasefire as a priority. We talked about it here in the past, that from the Russian side, there is no real interest in ending the war right now, except with a decisive win. And thus the US administration has the trouble of achieving a ceasefire, as they are not willing to put pressure on the Russians to a degree that would force the Russians to accept a real ceasefire, while they still want it, and the Russians do not agree and see no reason to follow the wishes from the White House. But that was it from me for today. Not that much of a situation report, because along the front line not too much is happening. If you enjoyed the situation report, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. And if you have something to add, then add it in the comment section. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.